Welcome back. So global variables are bad. They can cause a lot of issues. And how can we minimize them? With modern JavaScript, we have things like ES modules and module bundlers, something we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the course. But before we had those things, JavaScript developers used what we know now about the language itself to avoid this global variable issue. And it's called an IIFE, or an immediately invoked function expression. Let's see what it looks like. An IIFE is a function expression that looks something like this. Here we go. Confused? Don't be, because we already know this, and we should already understand what the JavaScript engine is going to do with this code. You see, IIFEs are a common JavaScript design pattern used by a lot of popular libraries, especially back in the day like jQuery or even Backbone.js. The idea was, using this pattern, we can place all library code inside of local scope to avoid any namespace collisions. So let's have a look one by one. The first thing we're doing is we're saying with this brackets, hey, this isn't a function declaration. It's a function expression, right? Because the JavaScript engine won't see function as the first item on the line. Instead, it's going to see these brackets. So this automatically makes it into a function expression. And then after we've done that, we've created an anonymous function. There's no name attached to this function. And then we immediately invoke it. That is, we call the function. So if I run this, well, I get undefined. Okay, but just to test our assumption, what if I do something like this? What if I use a function declaration and call it immediately afterwards? So that's our function declaration. And then right afterwards, I'm going to call it. I'm going to get a syntax error. You can't really call a function declaration immediately afterward. A function expression, however, you can. Now, what's the benefit in doing this? You see, since the anonymous function within this IIFE is a function expression, and it's not being assigned to any global variables, no global property is really being created, is there? And all of the properties created inside over here are going to be scoped inside here. So it's only going to be available inside this IIFE, but not outside. If I have variable a equals to 1, well, I can't really access a. A is not defined. Let's have a look at a diagram. An immediately invoked function expression simply allows us to call immediately as JavaScript is executing. It's going to define what it is, and right afterwards, with the brackets, it's going to call it. It's going to create a new variable environment, a new execution context, that's going to have our own variable scope. And this allows us to attach private data right in here that can be accessed by the global execution context because, well, the chain runs downward. Now, before I get into an example, let me just show you one other thing. What do you think happens if I remove or move these brackets to inside over here? Will anything change? No, it doesn't. We're still following the rules of JavaScript, right? We have the function expression because of the parentheses. And then right after the compiler looks through the code and says, all right, here's the function, we're immediately going to run it. Let's see this in action. Imagine I create another function here. I'm going to call it function A, another original name. And this function A is just going to return 5. If I refresh this function and I do A, I get 5. That makes sense. But then all of a sudden, this little bugger over here decides to pollute my namespace and create its own function, A, that mocks me and just laughs at me. So that now if I refresh and run A, oh boy, just laughing at me, ridiculing me. So how can we use IIFEs to solve this problem? And this is how it worked back in the day before we had ES modules. Again, something we're going to discuss in our modules section of the course. I can create a variable. Let's call it script1. And this script1 is going to equal function A, or we can even leave out the name if we wanted to. And within this function, because this is a function expression, I can wrap it in brackets and then immediately invoke it. So let's see what happens now. I'm going to save and refresh. If I call A, I get ha ha ha. Okay, nothing's changed. Instead of returning 5, I'm going to create my function, again, function A. And this function A, oops, let's make sure we fix that. This function A will now have return 5. And all we need to do is just return from here an object with A as a function. So that if I save here and refresh, let's say I run A again, well, I get ha ha ha. But now within my script1.a, I can run this and look at that. I have access to A because script1 now returns an object that contains this A function for me. Now, the interesting thing with this is that, well, we still have a global namespace. We still created this script1 global variable. But the good thing is that we can just have one variable, and this variable can be an object that contains many properties that we might want to use. And it only pollutes the global namespace once. More importantly, we're attaching this private data to a function that creates fresh environments for us. It executes them, and it only allows us to return whatever we want from inside this function. Now, libraries like jQuery used to do this a lot. For example, let's clear this and add a jQuery library at the very top of our file here. This is a jQuery code right at the top. So that now we'll have access to the jQuery library. This means that anything that comes after this script, well, because everything gets combined in the script tags, we can use jQuery now. So let's do that. Let's have a function that, let's say instead of this function A, we'll do the jQuery syntax to grab h1, which is this hello over here. And we'll just say on click, we want to run a callback function that simply, well, let's say hides the hello. So I can do this here if I want, but that's a topic we're going to get into a little bit later on. So let's just stick with h1 dot hide and see what happens here. And for now, let's just not return anything, just an empty object. I'm going to refresh. If I click here, hey, look at that. It's working. It disappeared. We have access to this $sign because jQuery provides for us the ability to use this from its library because it's added it to the window object. If I go to window.$, there we have something here. I can also do window.jQuery, and again, same thing. Now, jQuery inside of this library has a ton of functions, a ton of variables, but inside it, they can just create an IIFE and just expose for us this jQuery object that we can use. So let's play with something here. If in this parentheses, remember this is us executing this function. If I add jQuery here, after we call this function is going to receive this jQuery parameter. And we'll make this jQuery parameter OMG. That says OMG. Well, this should still work, right? This OMG syntax. If I refresh, let's save and refresh, and I click here, it still disappears. Because what I've done is I've added jQuery from the global namespace as a parameter onto my immediately invoked function. And this function, when it gets called, it's going to receive a parameter, which is jQuery, and we're just assigning it a variable, OMG. But this OMG still has whatever this library gave us. So I can use it whatever way I want inside here. Now, the interesting thing here is that we actually have a bit of a performance benefit here. Because before we didn't have this, when we looked at the $, we would go up the scope chain to the global namespace and find the $, and what it means. But this time around, because we've added our jQuery library as a parameter, it doesn't look in the global namespace, right? Instead, it looks at its local scope, which includes the parameter that we had. So we technically get a bit of a speed boost because we're not doing that scope chain lookup. As a matter of fact, we can do something fun here. Let's change this back to the $, and now return the $, to just equal hi. If I do this and I refresh and I run script1 dot $, you see that within this function, within this script, we've overwritten whatever the $, was, and it's just hi, completely useless to us. Immediately invoked function expressions are something we're going to get into a little bit more when we talk about modules. But I want to introduce them to you now because, as you can see, they take advantage of what we learned about scope. It enables us to attach private data to a function, and it creates a fresh environment for us so that we don't pollute our global execution context. As we start to get more and more JavaScript files, we want to make sure that we can wrap things in a function to scope things into their own environments and minimize the amount of data that we place on the global execution context. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.